July 20th, 1969. 500 million people sit glued to their television screens. A grainy black and white figure descends a ladder. Then, words that will echo through time.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
It was supposed to be the proudest moment in human history, the day we left our world and walked on another. The American flag stood planted in alien soil, boot prints pressed into untouched dust, and the space race was declared won. But almost as soon as it happened, a shadow crept in. The flag seemed to ripple in a place without air. The photographs looked too perfect, too staged, and in the decades that followed, a question refused to fade. Did we really go to the moon? Or was the greatest leap in history nothing more than a carefully staged illusion? The 1960s weren't just about music festivals and protests in the streets. It was a decade locked in the teeth of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union weren't just competing with bombs and spies. They were competing for the future itself, and the battleground stretched into the sky. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first satellite to orbit Earth. 2 years later, they sent the first living creature, Laika, a small stray dog plucked from Moscow's streets, into space. And in 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the planet. Each Soviet success was a humiliation for America, fueling a sense that the US was falling behind in science, technology, and global dominance. President John F. Kennedy's answer came in 1961 when he stood before Congress and declared that America would not just match the Soviets, but leapfrog them entirely. He promised that before the decade was over, an American would set foot on the moon. It was an audacious challenge, a deadline set in stone, one that pushed NASA into a frenzy of innovation and risk-taking. Billions of dollars flowed into the Apollo program. Engineers built the towering Saturn V rocket, the most powerful machine ever constructed. New spacecraft were designed, tested, and destroyed in the pursuit of something no human had ever attempted. But it wasn't without tragedy. In 1967, the Apollo 1 crew, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, were killed in a cabin fire during a pre-flight test. The nation mourned, and for a moment the dream of reaching the moon felt fragile, even impossible. Yet the pressure only grew. Every day, the Soviets pressed forward with their own lunar ambitions. And by the late 1960s, the world was watching to see which superpower would plant its flag in alien soil first. The stage was set, the clock was ticking, and for the United States, there was no room to fail. By the late 1960s, NASA had transformed from a fledgling agency into a sprawling machine of science and engineering. More than 400,000 people worked on the Apollo program, a workforce bigger than most cities. Factories across the country churned out spacecraft parts, rocket engines, and computer systems, all feeding into one impossible goal. At the heart of it all was the Saturn V rocket, a skyscraper of steel and fire, capable of producing 7.5 million pounds of thrust. This wasn't just a rocket, it was humanity's ticket off the Earth. Alongside it were the spacecraft, the sleek command module to house the crew, the service module packed with fuel and life support, and the delicate lunar module, designed like a fragile insect to land on the moon's surface. But progress was hard-won. Apollo 1 ended in catastrophe when a flash fire trapped and killed 3 astronauts during a test on the launch pad. The disaster sent shockwaves through NASA, yet instead of killing the program, it sharpened it. Every flaw was examined. Every screw and wire was checked again, Failure, NASA learned, could not be an option. Through missions Apollo 7, 8, 9, and 10, NASA pushed further and further, testing spacecraft, docking maneuvers, and lunar orbit. Each mission was a rehearsal for the real thing. The world was ready for the main act. Apollo 11. On July 16, 1969, 3 astronauts, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, strapped into the Saturn V. Hundreds of thousands gathered at Cape Kennedy, while millions more tuned in on live TV. At 9:32 a.m., the engines ignited, the Earth shook, and Apollo 11 lifted off the pad in a roar of fire and smoke, carrying with it the hopes of a nation. The journey to the moon took 4 days. Inside the cramped spacecraft, the crew endured weightlessness, radio checks, and endless system monitoring. They slipped into lunar orbit on July 19th. Collins remained aboard the command module, while Armstrong and Aldrin climbed into the lunar module, codenamed Eagle. On July 20th, Eagle undocked and began its descent toward the Sea of Tranquility. The world held its breath. As the lander approached, alarms rang in the cockpit. Computers threatened overload, and fuel ran dangerously low. With seconds to spare, Armstrong took manual control, guiding the fragile craft past boulders and craters until finally,
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
That night, Armstrong stepped down the ladder, pressed his boot into the moon's dusty surface, and spoke the words etched into history. Buzz Aldrin soon joined him, calling the alien landscape magnificent desolation. Together, they spent just over 2 hours outside, setting up experiments, collecting rocks, and planting the American flag. Meanwhile, Michael Collins orbited alone above, keeping vigil over his crewmates and ensuring their ride home stayed ready. After 21 hours on the moon, Armstrong and Aldrin blasted off in the Eagle, reuniting with Collins. 3 days later, Apollo 11 splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean. The astronauts returned as heroes, greeted with parades and celebrated by millions. America had won the space race, and humanity had walked on another world for the very first time. For many, Apollo 11 is not a mystery at all. The proof of the moon landing is stacked high, like bricks in a wall too solid to tear down. Believers argue the evidence isn't scattered or vague, it's overwhelming. When Apollo 11 touched down, Armstrong and Aldrin carried Hasselblad cameras modified for use in space. What they brought back wasn't a handful of snapshots, it was a visual archive. Thousands of photographs, reels of film, and hours of television footage showed viewers exactly what it looked like to stand on the moon. Believers argue that the details in those images are the strongest evidence of authenticity. The moon's surface appears harsh, desolate, and alien. Without an atmosphere, sunlight strikes directly, creating shadows that look strange to the human eye. On Earth, we're used to light scattering in the air, softening shadows. On the moon, shadows are sharp, pitch black, and unnervingly crisp. Skeptics sometimes point to this as proof of studio lights, but scientists note that this is exactly how lighting would behave in a vacuum. Then there's the dust. Every step Armstrong and Aldrin took kicked up powder, but instead of forming clouds, it fell immediately back to the ground. No air means no suspension, no haze. The footage captures the fine particles scattering in perfect arcs before dropping, behaving exactly as physics dictates in zero atmosphere. If it had been filmed on Earth, the dust would have lingered in the air. For believers, that one detail is almost impossible to fake with 1960s technology. While the photos and videos are compelling, the most tangible evidence came back in boxes, nearly 850 pounds of lunar rock and soil. These weren't just curiosities, they became some of the most studied geological samples in history. Under microscopes, the rocks revealed signs of a violent past. Many contained tiny glass beads formed when micrometeorites slammed into the lunar surface, heating the dust so intensely it melted into spheres. On Earth, our atmosphere burns up small meteors before they hit the ground. These glass beads are unique to an airless environment like the moon. The rocks also showed an age older than nearly anything on Earth's surface. Radiometric dating revealed them to be billions of years old, some predating the oldest terrestrial formations. They were bone dry, lacking the traces of water or weathering that mark Earth rocks, and their isotopic composition, especially of oxygen, was distinct from anything found here. Perhaps most importantly, NASA didn't keep them locked away. Samples were shared with laboratories and universities across the globe. Scientists in countries with no stake in America's glory examined them independently. Again and again, they confirmed these were not Earth rocks. To believers, that's ironclad proof. You don't fake geology, at least not with the knowledge or technology available in 1969. Some of the strongest evidence isn't a photograph or a rock you can hold in your hand. It's still sitting on the moon, quietly working half a century later. When Armstrong and Aldrin packed their tools, they also carried a set of retroreflectors, panels fitted with arrays of mirrors designed to bounce light directly back to its source. The idea was simple but ingenious. Fire a laser from Earth, aim it at the reflector, and measure how long it takes for the light to return. That delay can be used to calculate the distance to the moon down to a matter of centimeters. The experiment worked then, and it still works now. Universities, observatories, and even foreign space agencies have performed the test countless times. Believers argue this point is unassailable. If the landing never happened, how did the reflectors get there? For those who accept the evidence, the reflectors are like a signature, proof, written in light, that humans walked on the moon. Apollo 11 wasn't 3 men in a rocket. It was an army of human effort. Roughly 400,000 engineers, scientists, mathematicians, and contractors worked on the Apollo program. From designing rocket engines to testing suits to programming the computers, every piece of the mission passed through countless hands. Believers often ask, if the moon landing was faked, could that many people really keep the secret? To pull off a hoax of that scale would require a conspiracy stretching across universities, corporations, and government agencies, all in perfect silence for over 50 years. Not a single credible whistleblower has come forward with evidence of a staged landing. And then there's the ultimate check: the Soviets. The USSR had the technology to track Apollo 11 from launch to lunar orbit. If the US had staged the landing, Moscow would have exposed it in an instant, using the scandal to humiliate America on the world stage. Instead, the Soviet Union acknowledged Apollo's success and quietly abandoned their own lunar program in its wake. That silence speaks louder than any photograph. Beyond the photos, the rocks, and the reflectors, Apollo 11 left behind silent instruments that turned the moon into a laboratory. These experiments produced hard data, the kind numbers and graphs can back up, long after the astronauts returned home. One of the most striking was the seismometer. It picked up tremors on the moon's surface, moonquakes. Events unlike anything on Earth. Some were caused by tidal stresses from Earth's gravity, others by meteor impacts. A few were so powerful they shook the lunar crust for minutes, ringing like a bell in a way our planet never does. Believers argue that these findings proved not only that the instruments were really there, but also that the moon was geologically active in ways scientists hadn't anticipated. Another experiment was the solar wind collector, a sheet of foil designed to trap particles streaming from the sun. When brought back to Earth, it gave researchers their first direct samples of solar particles, confirming theories about how energy moves through space. And perhaps most convincingly, later missions, robotic orbiters from NASA, Japan, India, and China have taken high-resolution images of the Apollo landing sites. They've photographed the descent stages of the lunar modules, still standing in the dust, the trails of footprints etched across the surface, and even the faint tracks of the lunar rover left behind by later missions. For believers, this is the nail in the coffin. If Apollo was faked, why do modern probes from nations with no reason to protect NASA show the artifacts still sitting on the moon? To those who trust the evidence, it's overwhelming. The moon landing wasn't just broadcast on television, it's etched into the rocks, the data, and the very surface of the moon itself. The evidence for Apollo 11 can feel overwhelming. But for skeptics, each of these pillars has cracks. They argue that what believers see as proof is often misinterpreted, manipulated, or even manufactured. If the moon landing really was staged, the evidence might not just be weak, it might be part of the performance itself. Believers point to the thousands of images as irrefutable. Skeptics call them a staged set. They argue that the flag seems to ripple when no breeze should exist. Shadows fall at angles that don't match a single light source. The black lunar sky is empty when stars should shine brilliantly. NASA explained each of these oddities. The flag held its shape because of a stiff horizontal rod, the shadows bent because of uneven terrain, and the stars were too faint for the cameras. But skeptics dismiss these as technical excuses. They note that professional photographers have pointed out inconsistencies in the lighting, with objects in the same frame appearing lit from different directions. To them, this isn't an accident of terrain. It's the telltale glow of artificial lights. The absence of stars is another favorite. Skeptics argue that in a true lunar sky, a camera set for daylight exposure should still catch faint starlight. The fact that not a single image shows stars convinces them the backdrop was manufactured, either a painted canvas or a black curtain in a studio. To skeptics, these are fingerprints of forgery. The rocks are hailed as unshakable proof, but skeptics push back here too. They argue that meteorites blasted off the moon by impacts have been falling to Earth for millions of years. In Antarctica, these meteorites are easier to spot against the ice. To skeptics, NASA could have collected them and passed them off as Apollo samples. Others take it further. What if the rocks were man-made? By the late 1960s, scientists already knew how to simulate some extraterrestrial conditions. With enough time, funding, and secrecy, skeptics say NASA could have engineered convincing lunar rocks and distributed them worldwide. They point to the eagerness of foreign scientists to confirm Apollo's success, suggesting that bias clouded judgment. If you expected a sample to be from the moon, wouldn't you see what you wanted to see? The isotopic ratios, the dry minerals, the glass beads from micrometeorite impacts, all of these could be explained, skeptics argue, without astronauts setting foot on the moon. To them, the rocks don't prove a manned mission. They only prove unusual stones exist and that scientists trusted NASA's word on their origin. Believers often point to the retroreflectors as a slam dunk. Lasers bounce off them even today, proof that someone set them there. Skeptics don't necessarily deny the reflectors exist, but they question how they got there. By the 1960s, both the US and the Soviets had already landed robotic probes on the moon. America's Surveyor program and the Soviet Luna missions had shown that unmanned craft could deliver instruments. Skeptics argue that NASA could have quietly deployed reflectors on an earlier unmanned mission, then claimed they were left by Apollo 11. In their view, bouncing lasers off mirrors doesn't prove Armstrong and Aldrin walked there. It only proves a reflector is sitting on the lunar surface. They also note that lasers can reflect off the moon's surface naturally, albeit faintly. So when scientists say they get a return signal, skeptics argue it isn't unique proof of Apollo. It might just be Earth-based institutions trusting NASA's version of the story, with little incentive to dig deeper. To believers, the sheer number of people involved in Apollo, nearly 400,000, makes a hoax impossible. Skeptics flip that logic. They argue most of those workers were compartmentalized. An engineer soldering circuits, a machinist shaping rocket parts, a seamstress stitching suits. None of them needed to know if astronauts actually set foot on the moon. They only had to believe they were part of something bigger. In this telling, only a small inner circle, perhaps high-level NASA officials, government overseers, and a handful of astronauts, would need to keep the secret. Everyone else could be kept in the dark simply by following orders and trusting their piece of the project was genuine. Skeptics also highlight odd moments in interviews and press conferences. Astronauts hesitating when asked about stars, vague answers about details of the mission, or uncomfortable body language are treated as signs of deception. To skeptics, the absence of a whistleblower isn't proof of truth. It's proof that those who knew the truth were few and tightly controlled. Believers lean heavily on Apollo's science packages, seismometers that recorded moonquakes, solar wind collectors, and years of data. But skeptics argue this evidence only looks solid because NASA controlled it from start to finish. Every printout, every chart, every number first passed through NASA's hands before reaching the public. If the landing had been staged, skeptics say, the data could have been generated in labs, then dressed up as genuine lunar readings. The seismometer results are often cited, the moon ringing like a bell after impacts. But skeptics note those reports came exclusively from NASA. Independent verification didn't exist at the time. The same goes for the solar wind experiment. If a foil sheet came back with particles trapped, how could anyone outside NASA confirm it came from the lunar surface and not a simulation chamber on Earth? Even modern images showing Apollo landing sites don't quiet the doubts. Skeptics complain the photos are blurry, low resolution, and conveniently produced by space agencies aligned with the United States. Why, they ask, after decades of technological advances, do we still not see crystal-clear photos of the artifacts? To them, the persistence of fuzzy images looks less like proof and more like managed perception. For skeptics, the data doesn't close the case. It keeps it open. They argue the scientific evidence is only as trustworthy as the institutions that control it. And for those who already distrust NASA, the numbers don't prove a thing. There's one line skeptics come back to again and again. When a NASA astronaut, Don Pettit, admitted in an interview, "We don't have the technology to go back to the moon. We used to, but we destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back again." How could humanity achieve the impossible in 1969 and then somehow lose the ability to repeat it? For believers, the answer is simple. What he meant was that the infrastructure and program capability were dismantled, not that NASA literally lost the knowledge. The physics and engineering are still understood, but the hardware and systems need to be rebuilt with modern tech. For skeptics, it's the ultimate red flag, the kind of inconsistency that keeps the hoax theory alive. And that's where the conversation leaves the realm of evidence and moves into speculation. If Apollo 11 wasn't exactly what we've been told, then what was it? Once the evidence is laid out and the counter-arguments picked apart, the moon landing debate drifts into its most speculative territory. This is where believers in a hoax build entire alternate narratives, not just about whether the landing happened, but about how and why the story was told the way it was. Some of these theories stay grounded in politics and propaganda, while others veer into Hollywood or even the paranormal. Whether convincing or far-fetched, they've all added fuel to a fire that refuses to burn out. The most popular theory is that the entire moon landing was filmed on Earth. Proponents imagine a giant hangar or desert set dressed with dust and rocks, lit with massive studio lamps. To them, the suspicious shadows, the flag that seems to move, and the missing stars all point to cameras rolling on a soundstage. The Hollywood twist comes from whispers that NASA may have enlisted filmmakers to pull it off. Stanley Kubrick's 2001, A Space Odyssey had just debuted in 1968, showing breathtakingly realistic space sequences. The idea that Kubrick, or someone with his skill, could have helped direct Apollo 11's big moment has become a conspiracy legend. Whether in a Nevada desert or a tightly sealed studio, believers in this theory claim the world's most watched broadcast was less a triumph of engineering than a piece of Cold War theater. Not every skeptic believes it was all fake. Some argue that astronauts really did go to the moon, but the footage we saw wasn't genuine. Maybe the live transmission risked failing, or maybe the video quality was too poor for a worldwide audience. In this theory, NASA staged backup recordings on Earth, then broadcast them as if they were live from the moon. The reasoning is practical. The United States couldn't afford a failure. Billions of dollars, years of work, and the eyes of the world rested on Apollo 11. If the video feed had gone dark or looked unimpressive, the Soviets would have seized on it. Better, in this theory, to swap in polished footage than risk losing the propaganda war. To believers in this partial hoax idea, the rocks and data may still be real, but the one small step moment was crafted more for television than history. Another theory doesn't focus on lights, shadows, or film crews. It argues the moon landing was, at its core, a psychological operation. The United States didn't just want to win the space race, it wanted to crush Soviet morale. In this telling, the Apollo 11 broadcast was less about exploration and more about intimidation. By showing the world that America had allegedly mastered the impossible, putting men on the moon and bringing them back alive, Washington could project technological superiority without firing a shot. The Soviets, facing their own costly lunar program, might abandon the race out of sheer futility. Supporters of this theory point to how neatly the timing fit Cold War needs. The Vietnam War was raging, domestic unrest was boiling, and America needed a victory. Whether the landing was fully authentic or partially staged, they argue, its real purpose was geopolitical, to win the hearts of allies, demoralize enemies, and prove U.S. dominance on a global stage. Then there are those who believe the truth is stranger still. According to some fringe theories, the United States didn't make it to the moon by engineering alone, but with help from technology not of this Earth. Proponents suggest that during the post-war years, breakthroughs in propulsion, materials, and computing came suspiciously fast, far beyond what 1960s science should have achieved. To them, Apollo was proof not of NASA's genius, but of access to something hidden. Perhaps reverse-engineered alien craft recovered at places like Roswell, or even secret knowledge passed down through shadowy programs. In this theory, the landing itself did happen, but the way we got there is the part that's been concealed. The rockets, the modules, the computers, all were presented as human inventions, while the real breakthroughs were kept classified. For believers in this angle, Apollo 11 wasn't a triumph of humanity. It was a glimpse at technology we weren't meant to have. Taken together, these theories show the spectrum of doubt surrounding the moon landing. Some see it as a Hollywood fabrication, others as a broadcast doctored for propaganda. Still others believe it was part of a larger psychological operation, or even a glimpse of secret technologies far ahead of their time. What they all share is a refusal to take the Apollo story at face value. Whether grounded in politics or drifting into science fiction, these thought experiments keep the debate alive, and they lead to a deeper question, not just about the moon landing itself, but about what it means when humanity's greatest achievements are forever shadowed by doubt. More than 50 years have passed since Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface, or at least since the world watched him do it. For many, Apollo 11 remains humanity's crowning achievement, proof that we can reach beyond our world when we put our minds and resources together. For others, it's a story with too many holes, too many odd details, and too much political convenience to be trusted at face value. The truth is, the moon landing sits at the crossroads of fact and faith. On one side, there are the rocks, the data, the photographs, and the instruments still reflecting lasers back to Earth. On the other, there's the enduring suspicion that what we saw might not have been the whole story, that the greatest leap for mankind might also have been one of the greatest illusions ever staged. And maybe that's why this question still lingers. The moon landing isn't just about science or politics. It's about trust. Trust in institutions, in technology, and in what we see with our own eyes. Once that trust is shaken, even the most iconic moment in history becomes open to doubt. So, what do you believe? Was Apollo 11 the triumph we've always been told it was? Or was it something else entirely, a performance written for the world stage? Let me know what you believe down in the comments. And if there are other topics and mysteries you'd like me to explore in the future, I'd love to hear your suggestions. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the unknown, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. It helps the channel grow. And it means I can keep bringing you stories that challenge the way we see history and reality.